Gardening is one of those things that lends itself to innovation, trial and error, experimentation, more than many other endeavors. But the critical skill that most gardeners simply don't have the patience for oftentimes is also the skill that you need the most if your garden is going to become the most productive and abundant version of itself. Welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, I am Taylor, and I've been helping people start gardens for several years now, beyond building 3 of my own gardens over the past 5 years. And what I've noticed is that the easiest skill to overlook, but possibly the one that has the biggest return on investment, is the skill of observation. And as unsexy as that sounds, in this video I'm going to convince you that not only is observation a skill worth having, but that it's a skill that can be developed in such a way that it changes everything about the way that you grow. So if you're ready to learn, let's dive in. First off, observation. This is not an original idea that I came up with. Gardening experts have been talking about the importance of observation, and it's even the first principle in permaculture ideology. But what does it actually mean? Well, let me start with a simple example. When I read my kids a story, let's use a classic, Green Eggs and Ham, my kids will say something like, "Dad, he's mad," referring to the unnamed character who supposedly doesn't like green eggs and ham. That's a statement. They saw his expression in the illustration and made the observation, he's mad. And then once I confirm that yes, he is mad, inevitably they will ask, why is he mad? Now this question, however basic, shows that they, first of all, don't feel like they need to already have known the answer. In other words, they aren't embarrassed to ask, and it shows that they want to know the answer. I know this is perhaps obvious, but the point that I want to make here is that they see something and they put it into words, what they see, and then they take one more step and they try to find out why that is. Here's another example from my kids. Every other time I come to a stoplight while driving my daughter in the car, she asks me, "Dad, why did you stop?" And I usually ask her back, "Why do you think I stopped?" To which she replies, "Because the light is red." What's happening here at a certain level is that my daughter is processing the details of traffic rules, right? She's only 3, so she might have temporarily forgotten, but to get her back on track, she asks, "Why did you stop?" It's also possible that she knows the answer, but just enjoys the predictable dialogue that we have. Either way, she's processing and integrating what she's learned about the rules of driving into her memory. What she's not afraid of yet, at least, is to appear dumb for asking a basic question with a seemingly obvious answer. Sometimes my kids need to ask if they're perceiving something correctly before asking the why question. And I know that this isn't just my kids. Once they think they know what it is, they can ask why. And as ridiculous and as basic as this sounds, if we did this more often as gardeners, I'm convinced that everything would change about the way that we garden. The thing is, and I know that this is true for at least some of you, because this is true for me, we don't ask the what and why questions because at some level we're afraid to admit that we don't know the answer already, even afraid to admit that to ourselves. So why is observation so often overlooked? As I was preparing for this video, I was asking myself that question. Why have I not taken the effort to develop this skill in the past? And I think that for me, there are a few reasons that I can point to, if I'm honest. First of all, what I just mentioned, I feel like I should already know what's going on for some reason. There's a sort of self-sabotaging safety mechanism here when I feel insecure that I don't already understand something yet. And so I pretend like I already know the answer, or I pretend that the answer doesn't matter. For example, and I told this story in a recent video, my first ever compost pile that I made. I had piled up grass clippings and plant debris and dried leaves from around the yard into a big old pile, and what do you know, it heated up. I had made a thermophilic compost pile without even knowing it. And the only reason that I know that it had heated up was because one cold morning I could see steam rising off the top. And then I went to mix it up because I had heard somewhere that that's maybe what you're supposed to do. I could feel with my own hands that the pile was, in fact, flesh melting temperatures. The thing is, the next compost that I tried to make didn't heat up in any noticeable way. And so here, the opportunity to make an observation came into view. I had seen a previous compost pile heat up, and what I was coming to realize was that I never asked the why question, which is what I might call active observation. So when I went to make another compost pile, I had only made passive observations about what had happened before. And so my replication attempt was severely limited. Now at first, I'll admit that I felt some pride well up in me when my second pile didn't heat up like the first, and that provided a very small roadblock. I was very briefly tempted to pretend it wasn't my fault that the pile didn't heat up, which was silly and didn't last long. More enticing was the temptation to shrug and walk away without trying again. And if I didn't have any intention of making hot compost again, that's probably where I would have left it, and there would have been nothing wrong with that. But I did want more compost, and I wanted to learn how to heat up the pile to speed up decomposition. So I arrived at a third option, which is to ask the why question. Why did this pile not heat up? And this sent me down a huge rabbit hole on the internet that I've never really come out of and has gone way past composting. But when I started looking into things, I had to ask questions like, what things went into the pile? How much moisture went into the pile? How large is the pile? All of those factors I came to learn matter and contribute to a pile heating up. And so with a little experimentation, I was able to increase the moisture content of the pile and add some nitrogen-rich material, and the pile started to increase in temperature. Okay, so far this is a very low stakes example, I know, but the point is I made the observation that something happened and then followed that up with an active posture. Why did that happen? Or in this case, why did it not happen? Another quick example was when we first started expanding our garden, we found that many of the plants that we were growing in some of the new parts of the yard were stuck at a certain height. It was like they just stopped growing, and even though they looked decently healthy, these flowers whose stems were meant to stand 3 or 4 feet tall just weren't. Some of them stopped after growing barely 12 inches. And so again, we asked the why question. We did some research, took a look at our soil, and came to the initial conclusion that we had a compaction layer, just like a few inches deep. And there are so many of these types of speed bumps that we hit as gardeners: pest pressure, disease outbreaks, water retention, drainage issues, yellowing plants, just to name a few. And these refer to observations that we might make simply about our garden. But there are 2 other areas that we can really benefit making observations. The second one is closely tied to the garden, but it's slightly distinct. And I call this my practice. Composting fits into this, collecting and culturing indigenous microorganisms fits into this, and applying homemade liquid inputs, the timing, the area of the plants that I'm spraying them onto, seed starting, propagation. These are all what I call my practice as a gardener, and they're the things that are worth making observations about. If something works or doesn't work, am I willing to say what happened and asked why? And this is the last time that I'll say this, but again, this sounds basic and boring, but it's actually shocking how few people will actually do this, how often I avoid doing this. But what happens when we don't develop a skill of observation is that we greatly limit our progress, or at the very least, we make progress randomly and unpredictably. Wouldn't it be nice to make progress intentionally and in a way that you are pretty sure that you can replicate? Now, there's one more area of gardening that we will be greatly served by observing, and to illustrate what good observation really looks like, I'll share an old tale of a Swiss biologist, Louis Agassiz, and I'll link to an article that you can read for yourself if you'd like a more complete narrative. I was introduced to this through a first-person narrative fable called The Student, the Fish, and Agassiz. And the story goes that this particular student went to study under Professor Agassiz and received a brutally challenging first assignment straight out of the gate. The assignment was to look at a fish. The student began by observing the fish for about 10 minutes and decided that he had seen all there was to see. The problem was that he had been given hours to perform this observation of the fish, and so after a while he returned to take a closer look and began making some more detailed observations. A few hours later, the student began to sketch the fish and started to get a better understanding of what he was looking at. When Agassiz returned and heard the detailed observations from the student, however, he scolded him, saying that he had not looked very carefully. And so the assignment continued, and after hours of further study, the student reported all that he had since observed. And Agassiz was pleased at his student's observations, but when the student asked about his next assignment, Professor Agassiz told him to continue looking at the fish. And several more days passed, with the student continuing to pore over the fish, discovering new details each hour, each day, until he had mastered the specimen and eventually completed the assignment changed forever. This is a sort of Mr. Miyagi-style lesson where the purpose of the assignment is only fully understood until after it's completed. And while it's not my personal favorite way to learn, there is something to be taken away when it comes to the way that we can observe nature. The process of observing is the learning. And of course, doing things is the natural conclusion of the observation step. But the lesson from Professor Agassiz is that there's undoubtedly more to see and understand. And I still bristle at this from time to time because at a certain level, what discoveries am I going to make about nature that haven't already been made, observed, analyzed, synthesized, and applied? But this misses the point about observation in general. It's sort of like reading a novel or watching a movie. Someone could tell you what happens in 10 seconds. Star Wars, a story about a spunky kid with special abilities who leaves his home planet to thwart the oppressive empire as they develop a tool that could destroy planets. But if you hear that and just say, oh, cool, now I don't need to watch it, you're sort of missing the whole point. The movie was made to be watched. The story was told so that it could be experienced. Same with a lot of stuff that when it comes to observing nature. Actually getting out and bringing your full awareness into a natural environment, breathing the air, smelling the scents, listening to what's happening around you, and of course seeing, that's how you really internalize and learn it so that you can apply it. Doing this in your garden or on your property too is huge, and not just doing it once, but again and again and again. Do you really know where the sunlight falls on your property and for how long? Do you know where water pools and drains in your garden? Where does the wind blow in? And is there a particular direction that it flows? Are there places where weeds are growing vigorously and out of control? Are there areas where nothing is growing at all? Are there parts of your garden that are being overworked? Are there areas of your yard that aren't being used to their fullest potential? Even things like, where is the natural foot traffic? Where do people intuitively walk? These things matter because they'll determine what you plant and where. For example, if you're thinking about starting a new garden, you might consider walking out your door and getting the initial feel for where you naturally find yourself going. For this yard, I come out of the side door, I hang a right, and things open up. Now, maybe I think that all this area in front of me is viable growing space. But what observation means is that I actually need to stop and look. If you're doing this, I encourage you to write down the things that you see too. This is like my kids making the statement, he's mad about the green eggs and ham character. For right here, I can plainly observe that I'm facing south. There's a very mature pine tree shading the space and dropping needles, and there are trees in my neighbor's yard also casting shade. To my left, there's my neighbor's fence, and there's a big patch of uncontrollable vine that is creeping over the side of the fence. Next, I might ask some questions about this observation. What does that mean about the viability of the space? What does pine needle mulch do to soil? And what might I be able to grow with this much shade? What could I do about the encroaching vine? There's 100 more questions that I might ask as a part of my observations, and there's 100 paths that I could take here. And I know that this probably sounds painfully obvious and boring to most of you because you're experienced gardeners and you've got tons of thoughts and ideas springing in mind, but whether you're just starting out or if you've been doing this a while, just slowing down to make these simple observations can lead to a profound difference in the way that you act. 5 years ago, before Cassidy and I really knew what we know now, we tried to grow some thornless blackberries right here. We don't have pictures to prove it because they were such a shameful experience. They suffered and died fairly quickly for obvious reasons. Blackberries need sunlight, at least 6 hours, probably more, a day. They also need to grow in some decent soil. We didn't even look at the soil. Didn't test for compaction, signs of microbial life, nothing. We just dug holes and planted because this was a good spot and it was sort of out of the way. And now they're dead. Now the thing is, making this mistake wasn't the end of the world, thankfully. We weren't relying on those blackberries for our primary source of food or income. The stakes were pretty low, so at a certain level, this was a decent way to learn a simple lesson. But this lesson only became valuable because we made observations. We grew our knowledge by observing and asking why. Again, thanks for bearing with my dumbness. I know that that was probably painful for you to hear. And I'll end here on a sort of philosophical note. The underlying principle behind what I've been talking about with observation is that it comes down to mindset. Do I have a mindset that allows me to learn and grow? Or do I have a fixed mindset about my abilities and my situation? And this theory of a growth versus a fixed mindset comes from the aptly named book entitled Mindset by Carol Dweck. Folks with a fixed mindset might say things like, my abilities are what they are, I'm good at this or I'm not. They feel like effort is a sign of weakness. If I have to try, I must not be talented. Growth mindset folks say things like, my abilities can improve. I can get better with effort and practice. This is a very condensed description of the differences in mindsets, but what's so interesting to me about the conclusions that she drew and presented in this book is not that the folks with growth mindsets respond to failure well, they also respond to success in healthy ways. Because succeeding can actually be a limiting factor in and of itself. We've made this mistake in other gardens that we've started. One garden we had was just a small little patch, 100 square feet, and pretty much nothing went wrong. We mulched the soil, watered in Jadam microbial solution and Jadam liquid fertilizer, and we got some incredible flowers. We more or less hit our goal of growing a bouquet for every week of the summer. But this didn't really teach us anything because we never asked the question, I wonder why this worked so well. This isn't about being super hard on yourself or doubting your own abilities. It's about making good observations so that you can learn. The next garden that we started, things did not go the same. We had tons of pest pressure, we had compaction, poor soil, and the Jadam microbial solution and liquid fertilizers were not enough to get a good yield from the garden. And this hit pretty hard because we had built up all this confidence from the previous garden where things grew no problem without asking why it worked so well. So key action steps here. If you haven't yet, write down the basic observations that you can make about your last year's gardening successes and failures. Ask a follow-up question, why, for each of those observations. If you don't know yet, get out into your yard and identify the zones of your yard. How much sunlight are different areas getting? Where are plants already growing well or not? All the questions that I asked earlier in the video. And then make a point to get out in nature, hopefully when it's not too cold and covered in snow. And then look, do the same thing. Write down some observations and ask why. Force yourself to write down more observations than seem necessary. And if you've watched to the end, thanks for hanging out with me. And if you're interested in receiving more practical gardening tips and insights in bite-sized chunks, you can sign up for my weekly email newsletter. This is a great way to learn more about the techniques that we teach on this channel in 5 minutes a week. Link in the description or scan the code on the screen. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.